Hello everybody, my name is Joff Bradley of Tokyo University in Tokyo, Japan. Today I'm going to talk about the title is On the Psychic Tourniquet Strangling Asia's Youth. This is a defense of the critical post-media project. Before I get to the defense of Deleuze-Guattari, I'm going to talk about my apostasy of Deleuze-Guattari. This research on critical post-media builds on the Spark project in India with Alex Taikong Lee and Manoj NY, and more recently this year with the Academy of Korean Studies, which is focused on media in Korea. Today's talk I'm going to look at Asia more widely, especially Korea and Japan. So I'll begin. Today I'd like to discuss my apostasy of Deleuze-Guattari, which came to a head a few years ago, although it's been brewing for a while before that. Like many people, I was seduced by Deleuze-Guattari when I was a student in the 1990s. It was the time just after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Soviet Empire and the vanishing of Marxism. Like many, I think I was mesmerized by the concepts of the rhizome, the line of flight, deterritorialization, and a particular reading of Deleuze-Guattari's so-called Nietzschean anti-politics and the talk of the cyberborg as an overman. But my comments today come more than 30 years after that time, and now 50 years after the publication of Anti-Oedipe in 1972, a book which I still think is a book of ethics and political philosophy. While my skepticism about Deleuze-Guattari's philosophy lingers, I shall defend them against their trendy erstwhile detractors. But before I get to that, first of all, on the limits of Deleuze-Guattari's philosophy, now after their deaths in the 1990s and now 50 years after Anti-Oedipus, what of the unconscious turn towards the future? What of invention in the wake of manifold crises? And here is a quotation by Guattari speaking before the invention of the World Wide Web and the mass use of it in the early 1990s. He talks about the future, a future which is likely to be in major urban centers or countries even like Bangladesh, Mexico or Tokyo, where he says millions of people cluster. Because of the numbers of people who will live in urban cities, the United Nations says half of humanity is somehow living in an urban setting now. Guattari says that it's necessary to reinvent the body, to reinvent the mind, and to reinvent language. And he says that perhaps what he saw in early forms of telematic or information or audio-visual technologies might help us to progress in that direction of reinventing the body and reinventing the mind and reinventing language. So this is pre-1993 and pre-World Wide Web. That optimism has gone. It appears we are at the end of history. We live and think like pigs, like wild animals, like adult beasts, like cyber cattle or neural livestock, cyber livestock, those young Walkman totting nomads free in their heads, as Chatelet says. Think about the schizo nomads walking around the planet talking to themselves or to other people thousands of miles away through earphones and microphones and phone screens and other paraphernalia. So I'm going to suggest a series to somehow explain our contemporary moment. The series then is from the mole, the serpent, to the worming man, to cyber cattle, to wild animal, adult beast, to animalized otaku, to the hikikomori, and then to the hideous beast. So we get this movement from disciplinary societies, control societies, the uncontrollable societies, or the achievement societies. So a lot of people there, I mentioned Deleuze and Wilhelm Reich and Chatelet and Han Byung-chul, Alexander Kojev, Azuma Hiroki, and Bernard Stiegler among them. It seems we have passed from Deleuze's metaphor of the mole and serpent and onwards to Han Byung-chul's and indeed Stiegler's multitasking wild animal, and from there to the hikikomori, which I see as a close relative of Wilhelm Reich's Wormy Man. And let me say something about my rereading of Wilhelm Reich. The idea of the worm in man is described by the psychoanalyst Wilhelm Reich as parasitical and cancerous. It rises when we crawl into ourselves, when desire is denied its expression. In Deleuze and Guattari's language, this takes place when desiring machines break down and the body of the organs curls upon itself. The wormy man festers when the self and its body closes off the world, plunges and spirals into itself. In this way, hikikomori can be understood as the worm in man and can be read as a disastrous processual schizophrenia, a diminishing of self-awareness, a disturbance of ipseity. In his day, Wilhelm Reich was right to ask why there was so much narcissism, self-harm and love for the wormy man. Yet in our time, this wormy man seems to have metamorphosized into the serpent after passing through the subterranean species of the mole, and now it has moved on to a new wild multitasking animal. The serpent is a different kind of animal than the mole, as Deleuze explains in the postscript to the Societies of Control. And as we know, Deleuze finds it horrifying that young people desire constant training and constant improvement and constant performance valorization. And Deleuze warns us something comes from the outside. As he says, the coils of a serpent are even more complex than the burrows of a molehill. But again, there is a third metamorphosis. Han Byung-chul notes the difference between the mole and the serpent, describing the mole as the laborer and the serpent the entrepreneur. The latter is, as he says, the animal of the neoliberal regime, as the capitalist system switches from the mole model to the serpent model to generate more productivity. And from there we get to Han's wild animal, the multitasking wild animal, the wild animal that performs tasks unconsciously in a constant relay between consumptive attention and deep distraction. And I suppose this is close to Chatelet's obese cyber cattle. In the multitasking wild animal, indeed, even the adult beast in Alexander Kojev, we find a form of flat attention and the suffering of symbolic misery. And again, this is where Stiegler has much to say. The wild animal marks the loss of flow, the rise of deadly repetitions of stimming and perseveration, doing things obsessively without rhyme or reason, and indeed without pleasure. In Han Byung-chul's work, we find new descriptions of Korean society, and by extension, I'm applying this to Japan and to other countries in the Asian region. So, a description of Korean society. Han Byung-chul says, it's a burnout society, an achievement society, a swarm society, a transparency society, a society of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I want to interpret his view as a society of the social recluse, a society of hikikomori, a society of autistics, a society overseeing the collapse and disaster of desire, a society of self-marooned workaholics with no relation to the outside or to alterity as such, a risk-averse society, a society managed by the psychopolitics of integrated world capitalism. How does it work? Self-exploitation, narcissism, and psychic character armor to protect the self from the risk of contamination from the other. Those are the things which make it work. In extremis, this is a society of suicide and death from overwork, a society poor in world. It is our future. I am not alone in seeing this. And just to reflect a little bit of what I said at the beginning about Guattari's view regarding Bangladesh and Mexico and Tokyo and so on, something else has changed. Here, Baradi is important because he sees in South Korea, for example, somehow a blueprint for the future. this hyper connection, this somehow new world, this neo-human world. But he says there's a problem in Korea regarding cognitive mutation. There's a tendency, a propensity for autism, and a desensitization to the presence of the other. And this is where Han Byung-chul is very important in their dialogue, possible dialogue between the two. And fatally, Baradi says, this cognitive mutation can slide over to suicide, or karoshi, as you say in Japanese. And then what we have in this new world is a world of precarious work. Precarious work leads to depression, loneliness, and again to suicide. Well, in Han's work, well, let me turn to myself. I'm interested in the nature of the hikikomori, the social recluse, and the withdrawing into oneself as a survival strategy in the Korean context, or Asian context, or the Japanese context. Let me say something about the word hikikomori. It derives from the Japanese verb hiki, which means to pull back, and komoro, which means to come into. And it has found its way into different societies. The diagnosis of hikikomori shows similarities, this is what Kato says, with major depression, modern type depression, internet addiction, and or the autumn spectrum disorder. And there are some very good arguments and research to suggest that the reality of hikikomori is increasingly found across all generations and all classes. And this is what some of the medical some in the medical profession say. They say, as Sakai does, that in Japan it's become clear that hikikomori occurs not only in young people, but in all generations. And Choi, writing in the Korean context and noting the global dimension of severe forms of pathological social withdrawal, says hikikomori was first reported in Japan, but now it's a worldwide phenomenon that occurs not only in Asian cultures such as Korea, India, and Hong Kong and China, but also in Australia, Europe, United States, and Canada. Well, faced with this gloomy prospect, questions arise. What explosive or eruptive or disruptive concepts are available to rethink the question of desire in Korean society, Japanese society, Asian society, and outside of that area across the planet? Does the explosion of the hikikomori phenomenon somehow reveal the current cessation of flow in Korean youth, Asian youth, Japanese youth, planetary dimension to this problem? What new forms of the worm in man have emerged? And as you can see, there are projections that social recluse or hikikomori could kind of grow to a huge figure of 10 million. It's an incredible figure, really, and very worrying it is. Well, for me, this is a disaster for the body without organs, because in the enclosure within ourselves, in the cessation of desire, in our deadly cycles of ipseity, or the worm in man, as Reich says again, we suffer narcissism and self-reference, deadly repetitions, compulsive addictions, deadly refrains. This leads to a loss of eros, a loss of desire, a loss of relation to the singular, a loss of relation to the other. And this is why Han Byung-chul is important to understand our post-media era, alongside people like Felix Guattari, because Han Byung-chul talks about pornography and exhibitionism somehow replacing love and desire, and he talks about selfie culture and the way that we use photographs and take selfies to somehow hide the wounds or our own self-loathing or insecurities and so on that lie beneath this kind of positivity of a selfie. So Han Byung-chul is looking for what lies behind selfie culture, which is the wounds, wounded self, and that's because there is no relation to the other as such. The thirst for positivity somehow protects us from being wounded by the self's relation to alterity, to negativity as such. We can say, as Han Byung-chul does, that the unconscious somehow goggles oneself unconscious. And I want to add that it's more than that. Concretely, we Google ourselves unconscious as well. So what is left, says Han Byung-chul, is but the eruption of media, the eruption of psychic woes, the perversion of pornification of our transparent selves. Here the excess of positivity acting upon the Korean socius may be what R.D. Lang called the psychic tourniquet, that is the mental knots which stop the flow of desire, which constrict and compress desire to the point of spreading what he calls existential gangrene across society, or across, we can say, across the Korean or Japanese body without organs. Well, my gambit here is to think that R.D. Lang and Han Byung-chul can be read together, and indeed, contra Deleuze, Han is critical of what he calls the romanticized and idealized schizo image produced by Deleuze and Guattari, and Han Byung-chul insists that nowadays that body without organs has become decrepit, overrun with metastases and infarction, that's a tissue death. Again, I think this is much like Wilhelm Reich's Worm in Man, and this is what Han Byung-chul says. He says, the endless conjunction celebrated by Deleuze is ultimately destructive. It leads to a cancerous proliferation of the same, even to the hell of the same. Again, he goes on. In the time and space of so-called hyperculture, schizophrenic deterritorialization and lines of flight lead not to the negative, but to the rhizomatic proliferation of the same, to the accumulation of the positive. Well then, on this cynical account by Han Byung-chul, Deleuze and Guattari are in effect writing a glorious paean to global capitalism. And again, Han Byung-chul says, freed from all negativity, the schizo machine produces the violence of positivity. So he's making the point that our media saturated culture celebrates positivity and has an almost allergic reaction to the negative as such. Again, the question arises, is this what our society has become? Is this what Korea has become? Is this what Japan has become? Is this what Asian countries are becoming? Is this what we are all becoming? Franco Berardi too discusses the connection between rhizomatic effects, violence and explosion, noting the deleterious consequences, and the quote here is wonderful. The rhizomatic whirlwind of the networked experience drags the unconscious out of itself, externalizing it to the point of psychotic explosion. Or for me, this is the hideous beast, la bête immonde of Bernard Stiegler. Let me explain this. This is when the drives are somehow delinked from the sublime, from desire as such, when we can't sublimate the drives. And this means that the drives can run wild, can be destructive, can lead to violence with all kinds of hideous consequences. This, of course, means that society becomes uncontrollable. This is the death of society as such, as we can't have a antisocial society. It's a contradiction in terms. Well, for Han Byung-chul, the schizophrenic process, we can propose also another figure, that's the exterminating angel of Antiochus, has lost its diabolical, destructive, transformative dimension. Indeed, this observation resonates with the homogeneous patterning of K-pop or Korean culture, the Korean culture industry, with its perpetual repetition of the same for whatever ridiculous manufactured purpose. But on the question of the possibility of the line of flight, I think Han Byung-chul misses the point regarding the politics of Deleuze and Guattari, and it is Stiegler who provides a corrective reading. Stiegler, in an interview with Gerard Moore, invokes Deleuze and Guattari's concept of the line of flight, describing it positively as a reasoned practice, and suggests that we need new lines of flight in the form of a withdrawal from addictive media. Well, here the line of flight carries along with it a therapeutic and pharmacological and curative prescription. It's not the action of disconnection. And in this respect, I'm profoundly at odds with the anti-politics of Masaya Chiva, Nick Land and Andrew Culp and their ilk. Nor is it, in fact, the militant or unthinking expression of the Luddite, but it is rather a therapeutic relation with technologies, with exteriority as such, with alterity as such. And I think this is a point entirely missed by Han Byung-chul. So now, I hope you can see my renewed commitment to Deleuze and Guattari and to the critical post-media project. I think that Han Byung-chul misunderstands the transformative, metaphoric nature of the line of flight because it's entirely applicable to social phenomena such as hikikomori and their struggle to form a relation to the outside and to the other as such. The line of flight is a kind of Heideggerian zooming over to the other. At our most affirmative, we can say this is a question of the becoming of the hikikomori rather than the being of its miserable state or their miserable state. And regarding the intoxication and addiction to technology, I think in some ways it is Stiegler rather than Han Byung-chul who fully understands the gravity of the situation regarding technology's pernicious effects on reason as such, because Stiegler emphasizes what he calls the miscalculated loss of reason, which emerges from the what he calls disruptive divorce of computational understanding and reason. In Stiegler's interpretation of Deleuze's sense of quasi-causality, we can find the act of creation, quote, from which one can wrest oneself out of entrapment in a locked present, unquote, which is, I claim, what Han Byung-chul's project entirely fails to do. Well, for me, Stiegler stresses that the question is how to transform maladies like anxiety, stress, fatalism and nihilism into a line of flight, or in his argot, how to manufacture new molecules for intoxicating oneself differently. Contra Han Byung-chul, we can say that the line of flight captures most beautifully the possibility of transition, of explosion, of rupture, of pure becoming. Its connection to the rhizome, to experimentation and creation, carries with it a negative capacity and possibility. Or as Deleuze and Guattari say, there is a rupture in the rhizome whenever segmentary lines explode into a line of flight. Here's a quotation. Quotation. After 50 years of anti-Oedipus, we thus need to fabulate an alternative libidinal economy of desire to counter the short-circuiting of societal relations. And this is why I've turned to Reich and Lang and Guattari's relation to these thinkers. We need a new techniques to counter desublimation and disindividuation. We need a robust theory of the loss of desire as such. Why? We need to counter the loss of spiritual and symbolic misery and to counter the profound reign of stupidity. We need to struggle against the lowering of spiritual value and to find ways to embrace the contagious potential of becoming other. And to give this a planetary dimension, I think Brian Masumi is absolutely right when he says the absolute limit of capitalism must be shifted back from planetary death to becoming other. And because our reality is so grave, I think we must invoke concepts such as absolute deterritorialization, concepts like fabulation and utopia. And it seems to me that the line of flight, then, is not the irresponsible line of flight or escape, according to Han Byung-chul, but a line connected with bifurcation, with the incalculable, with the negantropic, with the open system. And here, Guattari and Deleuze have a nice connection with Kostas Axelos. I also think here Guattari and Stiegler and indeed Kostas Axelos speak to each other. Why? Well, because they put the planetary, its becoming other, back into its joyous errancy, its profound orbit, its true wandering path. And so, contra Han Byung-chul, I think we must affirm the destructive transitional nature of desire is pure possibility. Why so? Because otherwise we remain like ensnared animals, multitasking and stimming for any absurd reason, like adult stupid beasts with flat attention at the end of history, or those hideous beasts entirely captured and seduced by the capitalist mode of production, consumption and exchange, which is to say that mode of diabolical capitalism and accelerated production which nurtures auto-exploitation and narcissism and which as such depletes libidinal energies, exhausts and pulverizes the mind and confounds the negative, that is to say the capacity to say no to the way the world is. And for me, the negative would be the capacity to say no to capitalism's paranoid, depressive and suicidal functioning, which is built on a system which trundles on without rhyme or reason, regardless of the injunctions of Deleuze and Guattari. Thank you for your attention.